challenges we face with the Russian sanctions within the EU. And last but not least, we have Liana Bernard, who is a legal officer at Redress. Liana heads Redress's Wealth and Asset Recovery and has been closely following developments in the UK relating to Russian sanctions and efforts to confiscate assets. Liana is a new addition that you may not have seen on the agenda, but we're really happy to have her here, and she'll be speaking on creative routes to asset repurposing. So just to give you an idea of the format for the event tonight, we will first allow each speaker to give their presentation, and then we will follow this with a Q&A session. So all being well, we should have around 30 minutes for Q&As at the end. If you would like to ask a question, I would really appreciate it if you could leave that in the chat, as that would help us to organize the questions before we open things at the end. So that's the kind of the scope for the evening tonight. But what I wanted to first start with was just to go into a bit of a presentation on from my side on the kind of the overview of the situation relating to anti-corruption sanctions. So the sanctions imposed in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine are, of course, not the first time we have seen the imposition of sanctions in relating to international crises more generally, but also in relation to anti-corruption. And we have here kind of a strange mix in a way that these sanctions were imposed for political reasons, and we also have had them and we have also have a history alongside this of anti-corruption sanctions. And anti-corruption sanctions have been an important tool that have been used over the last 10 years, in which many of us have looked into, and really considering the question of how do we move from these kind of sanctions to investigation and asset recovery. So the most famous examples of these that we know are the imposition of sanctions following the revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia and Ukraine, starting in 2011 on. And these were sanctions regimes which were designed to both kind of show support for the changing government, changing regimes following these revolutions, but were also designed to be put in place as a stopgard to prevent the former leaders and the former regime officials relating to these three countries from removing their assets outside of Europe before and other countries before there was a chance for the new governments to start their investigations and to begin the process of prosecution and recovery of any assets which had been attained through corruption. Now, this regime was something which kind of gave a lot of, at the time, a lot of promise, and there was a lot of excitement around the development of these sanctions regimes, both in the countries of origin, so Egypt, Tunisia, and Ukraine, but also in Europe itself and amongst civil society organizations. What we saw, though, with the implementation of these sanctions were many challenges relating to how we move from the imposition of these sanctions to the question of investigation and recovery. And over the past 10 years, I think we've learned some lessons about how there is a big disconnect between the imposition of sanctions and then moving on towards something where we can really see money being returned to the people from whom it was stolen. So a lot of the questions that we see here are questions which have really a big potential when we're thinking about these Russian sanctions, even though they were not necessarily designed in the same way. Still, these questions of how do we then take this political tool which keeps money frozen in a certain way and transform it to something where we see legal processes starting and money being returned. So I think with this as kind of a setting, I would then hand the floor over to Sarah to talk about some of the initial challenges with the implementation of the sanctions from this regime before we go on to some of the specific challenges that we might consider when it comes to the Russian sanctions, starting with Maria. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Jackson. Good evening, everyone, and thanks a lot to SciFar, to Jackson, and to the SciFar team to invite me to speak today. So I will just briefly come back on what happened about 10 years ago following the Arab Spring, when many of the Western democracies adopted sanctions to to condemn the corrupt practices that happened in those regimes in Egypt, in Tunisia for years. And I will finish my presentation by giving you some details regarding a recent criminal complaint we filed last week against several Russian oligarchs. And I think it will be interesting to just explain why we did it and what we want to advocate for by filing this complaint. But first of all, I would like just to underline the fact that this is important to separate the fight against corruption from geopolitical, from economic and diplomatic issues. Sanctions are political measures. They aim to respond to a momentary situation, and they are intended to be lifted once this situation ends. On the other hand, confiscation measures are carried out within a judicial framework, which means that they are being taken by a judge under a civil or a criminal framework, and they are supposed to punish an illicit behavior that has been characterized as such under existing laws. It is important to say that not all sanctioned individuals are financial offenders. Those two notions are really different. And just because individuals are targeted by sanctions in response to a given momentary situation, this does not mean that that sanctions should lead to automatic investigation for entire corruption or other offenses. To launch such investigations, such anti-corruption investigation in most jurisdictions, you need to fill two conditions. One, you need to identify once when the predicate offense, the corrupt offense, did not occur within the territory that aims to initiate the investigation. You need to identify the assets on your territory. It is necessary to just create a link to have jurisdiction on the case. So you need to identify the assets, to link the assets and the targeted persons. And two, the second condition, you need to trace the money, to follow the money, to demonstrate that the funds that serve to acquire the identified assets were illicitly acquired. And it is important, once you have those two conditions, to conduct this investigation in accordance with the rule of law and with the principles that build our democracies, such as the right to a fair trial or the presumption of innocence. If we just keep those principles, those rule of law principles, it just means that we would fight corruption with the same tools that are being used by kleptocratic corruptors. And I think this is really important to say that, to just remind that, because for the last 3 months, since Russia invaded Ukraine, we heard a lot of proposals in mainstream medias just calling for confiscation without going through judicial processes or any other processes, but in respect with the rule of law. I am convinced that our democracies have the tools to initiate anti-corruption investigation now and to confiscate the assets that have been identified as part of the sanction regime. I'm convinced that we can open this investigation without changing radically our legal framework. I think that we have the tools. But if we have the tools, we clearly lack the resources, the financial means. Last week, Transparency International released a recent report entitled "Up to the Task," and this report shows that most of Western democracies they lack resources to investigate, to prosecute complex corruption cases. That's in our democracies, law enforcement units, financial investigation units are understaffed. And this lack of resources is clearly a lack of political will. So I think before playing the engineers and just trying just to be to confiscate the assets, the fastest way possible, it is really important to just make sure that we have the political will to target every illicit ill-gotten assets, not only the Russian ones, and to make sure that we do it in respect with the rule of law. And just to give an example, so I was mentioning just at the beginning of my presentation, 10 years ago, just following the Arab Spring in France, and it was basically the same in most of the EU countries, many sanctions have been taken, and in some countries, including France, some anti-corruption investigations have been launched. In France, it was the case for Tunisia, for Egypt, or Libya, for Syria. And if in Syria, the investigation targeted not the ruling leader, but one of his relatives, in the other countries, for Egypt or for Tunisia, the investigation opened in France targeted the ruling leaders or their really close relatives. And it's been 10 years now that those investigations have been initiated, and 10 years after, nothing or more has happened. I mean, I think barely a couple of millions have been seized, and most of the persons that were prosecuted just are free or they haven't even been interviewed by a French judge. So because of a political will, because we just put one judge with all of these complicated, complex cases, we are just running out of time, and the journalists, newspapers, they don't really focus on these cases anymore. All our intention is on Russia, but I'm afraid that if we follow the same track 10 years, we will be discussing maybe the next crisis, and we will remind what happened with Russia, because we like this political will. And so just to terminate my presentation, I would like to give you some details regarding a complaint we filed last week against several Russian oligarchs. We filed a criminal complaint against unknown, which means contrix in French, which means that we did not target specific cases. We wanted to broaden the scope of the complaint as much as possible, to touch as well the proxies, the intermediaries, the relatives that were implicated in the corrupt scheme we denounced in the complaint. However, even if we filed a complaint against unknown, we also developed a couple of cases that we thought were really emblematic of what is corruption in Russia. And we could focus on 4 individuals for 2 reasons. First, because we could link these individuals to their assets in France. This because we could access to open source information, notably thanks to the French Beneficial Ownership Register, which is open to the public since March 2021. So we could link those persons to many real estate assets in France, in Paris, we were near to the French Riviera. And the second condition, we could focus on these individuals because thanks to journalists, to parliamentary reports, etc., we could gather sufficient elements regarding their implication in corrupt schemes or regarding their acquaintance with corrupt persons. So by doing so, we hope that we could raise awareness on the fact that we could open investigation and that we should not wait 10, 15 more years just to have a conviction or a confiscation. We could have it in 4 to 5 years, which is not long under the justice criteria in France and in other countries, but we just need a political will to do so. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. That was super interesting, and I think you highlighted really important points that I think we can also pick up again in the Q&A session. So yeah, thanks a lot. I think it's a great start to this. Then I'll hand over to Maria to talk about some of the challenges and some of the questions we have specifically when looking at the UK and Russian assets.
Thanks, Jackson, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be actually here with Sarah and Raphael and Liana. It's such an important topic, and I do agree with everything that Sarah just said. I think that what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done, it has shown that there is the possibility of using sanctions, and the sanctions are being increasingly used beyond what, as Sarah said, was the original scope, which was using them as an economic warfare tool. So moving from that foreign policy goal, we're slowly seeing them used basically to respond to human rights abuses. We can also explore the use of sanctions to respond to organized criminal activities, and also as an anti-corruption tool. What, however, also we're seeing because of Russia, however, the war in Ukraine, is that First of all, there is a lot of confusion, as Sarah said, about what sanctions can and cannot do. Sanctions can freeze the assets. However, as the original scope was a foreign policy one, we are trying to affect and change a behavior. At some point, the assets will have to be unfrozen. They cannot stay in a sort of frozen limbo forever. If we want to think about going towards seizure and going towards confiscation, that's when asset recovery comes into place. And asset recovery is not always possible, mainly because, again, as Sarah said, I will repeat it a lot, there needs to be a link to a criminality in the first place. The second issue when talking about sanctions against Russia is to think about what kind of sanctions and what is the target of these sanctions. Right now, we can divide them into big groups. On one side, we have Russian state assets that belong to Russian state and by proxy, basically to Russian people. On the other hand, we have sanctions against individuals. These individuals are either oligarchs whose wealth is, we suppose obviously is linked to an original criminality that happened 30 years ago. So there is a corruption, there is a crime at the origin of their wealth. And then there are individuals who are linked to the Kremlin and generally the Russian state that right now, at least according to the US anti-corruption strategy, is defined as a kleptocracy. So again, a crime. So what happens is that now we're trying to think of a tool that was devised as a foreign policy tool to think about it in a criminal policy area. So what asset recovery does is to basically show that crime doesn't pay. If that is our goal, then that's when we can talk about moving from freeze to seize. As I said, right now, the UK really doesn't have the tools to do that. We have a series of tools under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Unexplained wealth orders are potentially the most famous tool being used, but they can go so far. Why so? Asset recovery per se is very complicated when dealing with proceeds of corruption. So even without talking about the Russian assets, we have issues such as the complexity of the ownership structures through which the money is hidden, offshore jurisdictions, the anonymity as well of the transactions, all favored by the work of what I don't really like the name, but the so-called professional enablers. So lawyers, accountants, art dealers, all these individuals that are in Western jurisdictions and that allow, obviously, that help hide and anonymize basically these transactions. In addition to these, when dealing with proceeds of corruptions, we also have to think that we're dealing with uncooperative jurisdictions. So if the individual is a politician, we will have to file mutual legal assistance requests, for instance, requesting evidence from the origin country that the corruption actually took place. That is not always the case. It's not always that easy. So you take all these issues that are already present when talking about a general, we could call it a basic corruption case. And with the matter of Russia, this is even heightened. We have the complexity of the ownership structures. We have, we're seeing it with Pandora Papers, Panama Papers. There's always a Russian name that pops up at some point. We're seeing lawyers, accountants, everybody helping, most of the times the famous Slack cases against journalists in the UK, libel cases are quite famous and are one of the most favored active financial measures that oligarchs use here in the UK. And then in addition to this, we have an additional problem that is quite peculiar to the oligarchs, and I find it very difficult to replicate it and to think about it in other cases, which is the what I would call it the historical criminality at the origin of their wealth, namely the oligarchs. As I said, they gained their wealth in the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. What happens is that the money has been laundered so many times through legitimate businesses that by the time that it is used to purchase a Picasso at an auction house in Mayfair or to buy an apartment in Kensington, that money, it's very difficult to link it back to the original sins, to the original crime. So you take all these issues and add to what Sarah added, that currently the NCA in the UK is properly under-resourced. We do not have the investigative skills that we would need to even just mainly investigate cases of corruption. So right now we don't really have the resources. You add all these complications and we find each other with nothing to do. This not said that there is not the the policy intention and the political will. Again, all eyes are pointed at Russia. I think that now is the time to actually start thinking about, alternative measures to assist recovery. We have the United States that have proposed administrative seizure. Canada, I think it was, Canada proposed the Repurposing Act, and I think that Liana might talk about it in terms of what to do to help reconstruct Ukraine. The European Union last week proposed a draft for a directive, which I think it was mainly targeting organized criminal activities, but it was also trumpeted as an option against the oligarchs' wealth. So I think that there are different proposals, not really in the UK at the moment, and I think it's good because the first proposals were quite scary in the sense that they were potentially going against human rights, due process. We really need to make the UK government understand and politicians understand that this is going to take time, and there is no shortcut fix, and it's no easy solution. Legislation takes a lot of time. So even if there is a political will now, we might wait a little bit. I'm quite positive, though, as Sarah said, there is the chance for us to draft something good. You look at many other legislations, Italy is one, France is another good example, Switzerland potentially. There are little bits everywhere that we could look at, see what's there, extract it, and then create a sort of Frankenstein monster of asset recovery mechanism. That, however, needs to be made in full compliance with human rights protections, regardless, seriously, of whose assets are. I think that to conclude my presentation, I think that what we need to think is if we're really trying to show that we're different from the autocracies that we're supposedly standing against, that's the first step in developing asset recovery mechanisms, respecting basically democracy and rule of law.
Thanks so much, Maria. That was a super interesting, again, oversight of some of the challenges that we face ahead. But also, I'm very happy that also you focus on some positives as well, because I think it's a very complex situation. I think it's one, as you said, that we need to really be aware of how complicated it is. But I think it's also one that we can, as you both said, something maybe we can get right in the future. So yeah, without me talking too much, then I want to hand the floor over to Raphael and to hear it now from your experience and the perspective of the European Parliament and your own experience on your own thoughts on how we can move forward with this challenging situation.
Thank you so much for inviting, and it's really a great discussion and conversation, and a very important one and timely one. I mean, I think we have two different strategic objectives and two different timelines. The first objective is a foreign policy goal. It's how we stop Russian aggression of Ukraine, how we stop the war machine of Vladimir Putin, and how we make a Russian regime withdraw and get serious into talking to the Ukrainian authorities to find an agreement. So this objective requires from us speed, and we need to send the right message to Moscow. And the right message right now is not really sent, because obviously when you freeze assets, the perspective in Moscow is that, yes, I mean, they are frozen, so they can be perfectly unfrozen when the West will need us again, and when the focus will shift from Ukraine to some other crisis in the world. And that's a very serious issue, and that's why we push so much for quick solution on how you go from a freeze to a confiscation or a seizure. And just to send the message to Moscow that actually this is not a 6-month crisis, if they don't stop, but a very serious one. And it's not that they cannot go to their villas and yachts for a few months, but that's definitive. And there we have an issue, because obviously we speak a lot when we speak about assets recovery of oligarchs, but our main target should not be oligarchs. If you want to send a message to Moscow, our main target, it's all the dignitaries close to Putin, who also are some kind of oligarchs and make a lot of money, but they are not like the Abramovich style oligarchs. They are the people who are actually making the Russian regime work and the war effort work. So these people, we need to sanction them and we need to find a solution. And obviously, if we go for a criminal option, then it will take forever and we won't send the right message at the same time. And I'm not saying that I have a clear solution. I'm just underlining that we need to have this foreign policy goal. And then there is another goal, and it can match and it can be complementary, obviously, but it is how we shape a resolution, legislation at the European level for asset recovery and for the possibility to have a quicker process able to show that crime does not pay and that we don't accept dirty money into our economy and that we cannot steal people, rob people, kill people in Africa, in Asia, in Russia, or wherever, and enjoy luxury holidays in your villas and yachts in Côte d'Azur. So that's the general message we all want to send. And these two different objectives, one is telling us to be prompt, and the other one is telling us to be actually deep and take time so that we actually make legislation that does not kill the whole idea of basic rights and rule of law. And this is the tension in which we are finding ourselves in the European Parliament as we speak, because obviously we want and we are calling for a quick extension of all sanctions, individuals and collective, targeting the Russian Federation dignitaries. First, we want the list to expand, because otherwise it won't work, and that's why we don't focus only on oligarchs. We want also military people, propagandists supporting the war effort. We want the regional governors making actually forcing people to enlist into the army to be sent to Ukraine. We want the entire machine to be targeted. But at the same time, we perfectly understand that then these are not the people that would be mainly targeted by the asset recovery directive or legislation. So we have these two different objectives. On the second one, which is mainly the concern of the topic of the discussion today, on the second one, obviously we need to change the directive in the European Parliament. We need to push for an extension of the non-conviction-based confiscation rules. We need to push for avenues for confiscation in civil proceedings. We need to base our efforts on the Italian example. Well, we have these clear options, but as it was said before, the problem we have is also a problem of political will, because even when you have legislation that are progressive on the issue, the question looking at the French administration, the French government, for instance, is how much energy, money, people, time you put on this. And even when you have momentum, even when you have a sense of gravity, of emergency, and even in the first weeks following the invasion of Ukraine, I remember I had meetings at the Ministry of Finance of France, and honestly, the number of people dedicated to this look for the Russian dirty money into our economy or into our resource was very, very low. So at the end of the day, we will be able to have a very interesting conversation in the parliament and with our friends in the civil society organizations. But if governments don't allocate energy, time, money, and focus on the search for proof, for the search for this money first, and on the actually making any form of legislative change that we will shape reality, then everything is useless, basically. So and that, I think, mainly the lesson. It's very good to have a progressive framework, but if you don't have the wish to progress at the top level of the government, then obviously your framework is always good because you can make campaigns around it, and sometimes have few cases that will advance, but you won't have you won't reach the objectives that are ours, which is that we want to get rid of this dirty money in Europe, and that's the tension between two, and that's why I have questions, also not just assertions. I have questions on my two co-panelists, is how you go from one to another without losing the emergency, the sense of emergency that we all have now on how to send the right message to Moscow as we speak, not for having a general better European legislation or European policy, but for having a stop of an ongoing slaughter and aggression. So how we can use all the work we are producing on the general framework to send the right message now. And this is a very complicated question. I understand perfectly well. And I love to end with a question, because sometimes it's good to admit that we don't have all the responses.
Thank you very much, and yeah, also a very interesting question to end on. So thanks so much for that, and thanks really for this oversight of some of the problems, and again, I think it's really important you raise this question of urgency and the tension between the two things we want to achieve. So lots to reflect on, I think, especially when we get to the Q&A session. Then I would pass the floor to Liana to round off our presentations for today, and to talk about some of the ideas for how some of these issues could be overcome.
Thanks so much, Jackson, and thanks so much for having me. Really interesting discussions so far. So I think, certainly at Redress, we are advocating for the government to come up with a viable legal solution to confiscate Russian assets and repurpose them for victims. However, as we've been hearing in the discussions today, there are significant legal, sort of practical challenges to this, human rights challenges to this, and the solutions may take time, although we do carry optimism that there is a solution. So in the meantime, I think it's important to think creatively to look at alternative routes to asset recovery and repurposing off the back of sanctions. There's two ideas that I'm going to float past you all today. The first one looks at persuading sanctioned persons to voluntarily forfeit a portion of their funds. And I think there's been a question about that in the chat. And the second point I'm going to address is looking at repurposing fines for sanctions breaches. I expect the first one might be more controversial than the second, but really interested to hear different views. So looking at whether we can persuade sanctioned persons to voluntarily forfeit a portion of their fortunes, I just want to update you all on the case study of Roman Abramovich and his sale of Chelsea Football Club. So as you all know, Abramovich is a Russian oligarch. He's one of the richest men in Russia, and until recently, he was the owner of the Chelsea Football Club for 19 years. So back in March, he announced that he was selling the football club and that all net proceeds of the sale would be donated to victims of the Russian war in Ukraine. Skeptics think that this was a tactic to dissuade the government from sanctioning him, but nevertheless, they actually did so a few days later. So subsequently, a deal has been struck whereby the UK government has provided a license for the sale of the football club to go ahead. And the proceeds of the sale, which is £2.5 billion, will be deposited into Abramovich's bank account, which is frozen. Then the plan is for that £2.5 billion to be donated to a charity set up to benefit victims of the war. And the charity is to be set up by the former head of UNICEF, Mike Pembrose. And when the UK government is satisfied with the plan to repurpose the funds, it will issue a special license allowing the charity to control those funds. So just to give you perspective on this, £2.5 billion is more than 5 times the value of the humanitarian and economic support that the UK government has committed to Ukraine since the invasion. So the potential impact for the kind of funds that we're looking at belonging to these oligarchs is huge. When we look at the impact on Abramovich himself, so he obviously lost the 2.5 billion in profits. He also lost out on a £1.5 billion loan that he'd made to the football club. So he's lost £4 billion in this process. However, his current wealth is still estimated at £6 billion. So it's obviously proportionally a massive hit to him, but he still remains exceedingly wealthy on paper. So this is quite a niche example, but I think it's a really interesting example of considering how voluntary forfeiture could be used to address the reparations question. So there's this sort of suggestion that's been raised about the potential for oligarchs to pay to come off the sanctions list, with the proceeds going to rebuild Ukraine. And this was reportedly proposed at the G7 finance ministers meeting in Germany last week by the Canadian representative. This proposal carries many practical and moral questions. So at this stage, very much proposing it as an interesting point of discussion rather than necessarily advocating for it. So how would it work? The details of the proposal have not been reported on, save for the caveat that it would only be done with the support of the Ukrainians. So I've sort of brainstormed a little bit how it might work. It would probably be more appropriately applied to oligarchs who are not directly involved or very closely connected with the abusers, those who have very sort of peripheral relationship and who are unlikely to have their assets confiscated under other forms of accountability. As the previous speakers said, you know, there's really no way we can connect it evidentially to any sort of unlawful activity. So the agreements to lift the sanctions could also carry a behavioural change element. So, for example, the individual could be requested to forfeit a certain amount of money, potentially cut links with Putin or cease certain business activities, and potentially denounce Russia's invasion publicly in order for the sanctions to be lifted. And then to ensure the funds are forfeited, it could be done through a license, as in Abramovich's case. And there could also be a situation where failure for the individual to comply with the conditions of the agreement could lead to them being re-sanctioned. So that's my sort of food for thought about how that might work. I've given some thought to what the pros and cons or the concerns might be. On the pros side, there is a thought, is this the most pragmatic way forward? Even if we are able to introduce laws that are more flexible to better enable confiscation, like Canada and the US are attempting at the moment, it is likely that we would still never have sufficient evidence to, actually confiscate some of the assets, particularly connected to the oligarchs. So in this situation, voluntary forfeiture might be the only way forward in terms of asset confiscation. It is potentially a win-win situation. There is some level of accountability for those that are connected to Putin and his regime. And there's also practical delivery of reparations for victims. And, as I noted in the Abramovich example, there is a potential for massive impact if we are able to confiscate some of these funds. My cons list or list of concerns is slightly longer. So there's a general concern that it's lacking in integrity. There's a risk that it sends a message that you can buy your way out of accountability. Following the agreement to lift the sanctions, the individual could simply move their assets to another jurisdiction, which minimizes the threat of re-sanctioning for non-compliance with the agreement. There is the risk that the money that they are required to forfeit is really small relative to their wealth elsewhere, which would have a low accountability impact. So again, Abramovich with his 2.5 billion versus retaining 6 billion is actually going to hold them properly accountable. There's also a risk of a lack of a consistent approach or a lack of consistent impact, because each case would be different in terms of what assets have been frozen, for example, and there would be a lot of discretion, I imagine, in dealing with each case. There's also the risk of undermining the original purpose of sanctions, which the other speakers have already spoken to. I think particularly in the UK, there's a risk of the legal challenges to those sanctions. So asset forfeiture is not a legitimate purpose for sanctioning. Legitimate purposes tend to be, deterrence and accountability or behavioural change. So if it's perceived that the government is only sanctioning in order to eventually confiscate their funds, this may lay the groundwork for judicial review. I think there's also a moral issue in terms of pressuring with them to forfeit the funds. I've referred to it as voluntary forfeiture, but in the face of indefinite sanctions, in practice, does that individual really have a choice about whether they decide to do a deal or not? Is this a fair form of justice? Alternatively, it could be seen to being akin to, say, a plea deal in a criminal context where the accused pleads guilty to a lesser charge in favour of the bigger charges being dropped. But again, I think it's certainly not perfectly analogous and it's not clear cut. So that's a bit of a mind dump for you all of some of the thoughts that I've had about the sort of pros and cons of this. I'm sure there are plenty more, but I think from our perspective, ultimately taking a victim-centered approach is really important in sort of looking at these options. And actually hearing from victims, what are their priorities? Would they be willing to forego a certain level of justice in order to have the practical delivery of reparations when they're so needed? So I think that could kind of be the moral guidepost for deciding on that proposal. The second thing I want to talk to you about was the possibility of repurposing fines for sanctions violations. So I imagine this is probably slightly less controversial. Basically, whenever individuals or companies are found to have violated sanctions, any fines imposed could be repurposed for the rebuilding of Ukraine and for victims. So the key benefit of this is that in most jurisdictions, this wouldn't require legislative change, simply really the political will to donate the funds rather than putting them into the public purse. So as a couple of examples, so just last week, the British authorities raided an oligarch's mansion in Surrey on suspicion that he had breached the sanctions that were imposed on him in March. So we will see what happens in relation to that. Last month, the US charged a Russian oligarch with sanctions breaches because he runs a pro-Putin media empire and he'd hired a US citizen to run his television networks. In March, there were reports of a London headquartered port operator working in Turkey. There's a risk of them breaching sanctions laws by allowing Abramovich to dock one of his yachts there. So there are little examples coming out of sanctions breaches, and if states were to prosecute them or fine them, those fines could be repurposed. Another option could be looking at deferred prosecution agreements, so encouraging the sanctions breacher to forfeit a certain amount of funds in order to avoid prosecution. And that could be more relevant, say, for individual oligarchs who would rather lose £1 billion than face jail time, for example. So since the Russian invasion, sanctions enforcement has obviously come more into the spotlight. The UK recently introduced an Economic Crime Act, which made breaches of sanctions that attract a monetary penalty strict liability offences. So that means that prosecutions should be swifter and easier. And the UK government has also announced that it intends to set up a dedicated kleptocracy team within the National Crime Agency to investigate evasion of the most recent Russian sanctions. And of course, the European Commission proposal last week looked at creating a kind of standardized crime for sanctions violations and circumventing sanctions and standardizing that across the EU. The main sort of issue, I think, in this proposal is that in order for it to be effective, practical sanctions enforcement is crucial. So that means we need to have resources invested in monitoring sanctions compliance and prosecuting the breaches. So, for example, in the UK, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, OFSI, has had a really low enforcement rate for breaches of sanctions, and the fines are also really low. So in the past 4 years, OFSI's only issued 7 monetary penalties on 6 entities, amounting to £20 million. And obviously, there's a massive potential to scale that up in the recent context. So really, it's crucial that states consistently and effectively enforce sanctions regimes at the national level, and this would protect the integrity of their regimes, but also potentially lead to funds being available as reparations for Ukraine. So to sum up, I think while there's no easy legal solution, we can think a little bit creatively about asset recovery, and that victim involvement in considering these avenues is critical to ensuring that justice is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liana. That was also really lots of things to think about, and lots of open questions, which are super important and super interesting to consider. I know that we have about 35 minutes for questions, but I know that Raphael, you have to leave in a few minutes. So maybe I can start by posing a question to you, so we can get a short answer for you before you have to go. So my question is that, I mean, one of the main things that one of the themes throughout everybody's discussion has been the question of resources for investigation and resources for authorities who are responsible. Do you see any opportunity for work at the European level to encourage member states to prioritize this kind of work? Is there anything in the upcoming legislative discussions that could be used to push for some more resource commitment to this investigative side, which also may also work as part of the deterrent factor as well, I could imagine? I think you're muted still.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah, I said yes. Of course, there is possibility to push for it. I mean, I think the message that is sent from the European Commission is already this one since the very beginning. If we speak about this sanction, and from day one of the aggression, I think that the message coming both from Parliament and most of all from the Commission was this one. But then the question is whether in Paris or in Berlin, the administrative resource are put at the service of what is generally requested to every member state. And this is something that I'm not sure it's fully done. I mean, we have all seen these cases of police being sent to places only when you had Instagram polemics, yes, about oligarch or girlfriend or daughter posting photos of Instagram on Instagram, and then public outcry, and then reaction of police. So basically, like we are in a situation where sometimes we have the impression that we are actually putting the resource only when there is a focus from the outside, from the public opinion, or from the NGOs, which is really a disaster in terms of message that we send. And if in the European Parliament, obviously, we will call for more than this from the Commission. And there is one topic that we didn't touch upon yet. It's the question of sanction regime. In general, for cases of corruption. I mean, from my side, I didn't speak about it. And this is really, and I will leave you with another question there. I don't know why today I'm in this mood, and I beg you to forgive me for that. But we have this discussion, and it's like a repeating discussion. It's whether we create a new instrument or we for corruption, or we insert corruption in the existing global sanction regime. So we have a lot of discussions. The work in the Parliament on the Asset Recovery Directive will be very important, and we will push for clear initiatives which are already existing to be developed, and most of all to be implemented, because we have a lot of initiatives coming from the Commission once again, but we don't have clearly the wish to implement them, and that's something quite changing, I think, thanks to the work of the civil society, but also because of the war in Ukraine. And people were suddenly shocked to see that actually those who were enabling or participating in the regime that was committing these massacres would actually enjoy a very happy life in holidays in Courchevel or in Nice. And this has really shocked the public and made clear that there was a need for support for the fight that's ongoing for so long now on asset recovery. But that's why we need to maintain this attention, even when Ukraine will not be the main focus of people's life, which is unfortunately already happening, because we live in a red fish society, and people are zapping from one topic to another. But we need to find ways to actually maintain the pressure of the public opinion. Otherwise, governments won't do it because it's complicated, because it might have some repercussions also when we are speaking about really big money, and because it's as we saw, it's also complicated in terms of legal proceedings. So the only way we can move forward on this is if we keep this pressure very high. And I'm sorry I have to leave you, but be sure that in the Parliament we will try to keep it very high in the agenda.
Thank you so much, and yeah, let me take the chance to thank you then for your contribution and for answering this question. It's been really helpful to have you here, and I think very interesting for everyone. So thanks again.
I leave you questions, and so I will check the response after.
I'm not sure we'll have solutions, but it's anyway good that we're thinking about the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe actually I would move on to the questions posed in the chat, and I think the first question is an answer, but the second question I think is also a very important and interesting one for us to consider. And I'm not sure that any of you are going to have an answer, but I think it goes to the question of asset recovery to who, because I think this is a lot of the media reports, a lot of the discussions have assumed that asset recovery, any recovered assets would go to the Ukrainian people, but as we know, asset recovery does not typically work this way. Normally, the process for asset recovery is that we talk about returned money going to the benefit of the people from whom it was stolen, in the context of asset recovery, in the context of corruption. So how do we address this challenge? I'm not sure that any of you are going to have an answer, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this challenge. If any of the other panelists would like to engage with this quite complicated question.
I can give it a try. I mean, yes, this is obviously a really complicated question, and but I mean, we can say that in asset recovery, most of the countries, they don't do nothing, even in regular cases, without speaking of wars, etc. So regarding the Ukrainian case and the Russian oligarchs' assets, every option are on the table, and if we want to dedicate this money once it's properly recovered and confiscated to rebuild Ukraine, I think it's possible to do it in a regular manner, in a transparent manner, and in an accountable manner. And I think this is where it will begin to be quite complicated. It's how we will return that, because if we decide to just dedicate those assets to a specific point, it will be a lot of money, and a lot of money in such cases. It's usually means big risks of misappropriation, of embezzlement, etc. And I think allocated to the Ukrainian to rebuild Ukraine, I think it's not necessarily a bad idea. I think it needs a dialogue. This dialogue will happen after the war, obviously. I think nothing will happen just during a crisis situation, but we will also need to, as a civil society organization, to advocate for the restitution of this money to Ukraine or else, but in a transparent and accountable manner. I mean, in accordance with the principles we've developed a couple of years ago with CIFAR and other NGOs.
Just to jump in, I think it's such a good question, and I think had there, obviously, if there wasn't the war in Ukraine, then traditionally we would be saying, well, these are corruptly acquired assets; they belong to the original victims, which is the Russian victims, and so it's it's really complex. I think just speaking on the example from the sale of Chelsea Football Club and Abramovich's funds. So he, as reading between the lines in the media reports, it seems like he originally set up the idea that this former head of UNICEF would be the one to run the charity, and he actually kind of established that link. And he committed for the funds to go for victims of the war and didn't specify that it would be Ukrainian or Russian victims. You know, it seems that it could go to both. So we're yet to see how that will play out in practice and how sort of political that will get. But I think it is really important to remember that, you know, the Russian people are victims too, both of corruption and the war. So I think a sort of a degree of flexibility there to consider all the victims is really important.
Yeah, I agree actually with Liana. I think it's easy now to think that the only way that these assets can be repurposed is to obviously reconstruct and rebuild Ukraine. However, not all Russians are agreeing and feel represented by the Russian governments. And as I said, there is an historic criminality that goes back to 30 years. So this money has been plundered throughout the decades. So it's not an easy answer, even though I feel that at least in the UK, it's just everybody's just going to one solution. I think we need to think about it more thoroughly. And the problem then, even if and how and when the war will end, then if we decide to give the money, to return the money to the victims of Russian corruption, that's when what Sarah said comes into play. So the matter of how do you ensure that the money is not re-laundered, and how do we ensure that there is a transparent and accountable return? And what happens right now is that most of the times, I don't know if you recently see the FATF State of Effectiveness report, the majority of mutual legal assistance requests are reactive rather than proactive. So we do not see from the origin country those requests of returning money. So what we will need, even just thinking about the future and thinking beyond Russia, which I think is very important, because I know that all the eyes are pointed at Russia, but corruption is very widespread. I think we should also think about how destination countries can, for instance, draft guidances, can draft some guidelines to help drafting these mutual legal assistance requests and allow for the safe return of this money. I see I opened.
Yeah, I see 3 hands up, and I would assume then that these are responses to the panelists' points. So if so, then we can start with Sergio.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me well? Okay, that's fine. Sergio Tofilat, Community Watchdog Moldova. I'm a whistleblower and analyst on energy policies and banking frauds. I liked very much Maria's speech, and it brought me to a feeling of deja vu. We had very similar problems discussed back in 2018 at the illicit money flow event organized by Chatham House. I remember that the representative of NCA was talking about quantum computers to deal with the suspicious activity reports. Very, very funny for me. I have a couple of questions. So, as I understand, the asset confiscation is very difficult without proving the predicate crime. And one should be very optimistic to believe that a Russian court will provide us a decision that will prove that the money have been received from a crime. So Liana actually partly answered this question, but so what are the latest tendencies on how we confiscate the assets? Because it should be obviously done by a court, and without evidences, it's very difficult. Secondly, so on investigating crimes, there are, from my perspective, there are 2 approaches. One is expensive and time-consuming, to have very strong institutions with plenty of personnel, with significant budget. But the other approach is less expensive and more effective. It's to encourage the whistleblowers and the insiders to provide evidences. So from this perspective, what kind of protection and reward the states provide to such kind of insiders and whistleblowers? And the last one. Besides the proceeds, so we see that most of the proceeds are moved through the banking system. But we have a relatively new threat or tendency. This refers to the crypto funds. Cryptocurrency was very hard to trace because people don't interact with banks, they don't provide any IDs. So it's very hard to trace. And they have been extensively used by Russian intelligence services for different hacking attacks like Bundestag, World Anti-Doping Association, or even meddling with US presidential elections. So the question is, are there at least any attempts to trace or maybe even freeze such crypto funds? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Maybe I could also just take the next couple of questions, and then we can see if we can collect some together and pass over to the panel. So if I pass over to Roland.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roland Papine from Transparency International EU. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion. My first question is that in this new proposal, which was published by the Commission last week, some of you already mentioned, I was wondering, because I'm a bit unsure about this, the fact that there for the asset recovery offices, they charge them for the international tracing tasks. And I'm a bit unsure if it makes sense to be there, or is it just makes a kind of duplication and makes it even scatter the landscape of like who is doing the tracing of the assets, or does it make sense from your experience, from your perspective, to have that at this task at asset recovery offices? Also, I just wanted to mention when the returns came up, that there is nothing basically about the returns in this new proposal, which is very interesting. And I have one comment regarding Lena's examples and Abramovich and the whole idea that someone can just buy off their moral, their membership in the club of the morally nice people. And of course, you mentioned some of the moral problems, but I would really just push a bit more on that, because I think this is unacceptable, especially in the case of Russia, and especially when we talk about oligarchs or other important people in Russia, because we do know that they are not oligarchs because they happen to be oligarchs or because they were successful. They're there because Putin made them be there, made them in their position. So I would rather think about them as managers of their different institutions and companies than individual oligarchs. For example, when in Ukraine, where they are competing oligarchs you have. In Russia, you don't have competing oligarchs anymore. So if we would allow it to happen that one or few of them are the new PR persons who are, I don't know, like realizing the moral bad behavior of the war or whatnot, we're just giving like a carte blanche to them and to rich people, and we are making an amazing PR material for the Kremlin. And I think it is unacceptable morally for Ukrainian people, for the victims of the war, but also for the Russian people, for those people who were actually against the war from the first time, those who were against Russian imperialism for years, and now who are in prisons and who are facing trials and a horrible oppression. Whereas if someone is rich and says a nice PR statement and gives a part of his money, I mean, again, I don't know if you have 10 billion euros, how does it feel to give a 5 million of it? I have no clue. But still, I think it's very obvious that for them, it's a little less burden than for actual people who've been against this war, like really, and not just on a PR side. And what really comes to my mind is that you probably, as many of you remember, this Russian TV anchor, Ovsya Nikola, who was there for one sign, 1 minute, and then she became very famous of being against the war. There are very clear signs that it might have been staged. I mean, when she woke up from the police department after 15 hours of detainment, she had perfect makeup. For example, she was ready to give a press conference, and there were some other weird signs. And personally, I got very upset to see that the Western media praised her, and they forgot, I don't know, the journalists of Novaya Gazeta, of Medusa, of Echo Moskvy, and all the others who've been actually fighting for something noble in horrible conditions for years, and now we have a PR material. And my worry is that we are creating this again with Abramovich and the others. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Panelists, don't worry, I'm trying to gather these together, so so don't worry that there's lots of points being raised. Tika, maybe I can just hand the floor over to you, and then we can sort through some of the comments and questions, and I'll try to pose them to the panelists. We can't hear you, or at least I can't hear you. Still not.
Okay.
Now yes, now yes. Now not again.
Yes, I have some issues with my laptop. You don't hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now.
Okay, I'm sorry. The fact that we need rule of law and due diligence measures to be in place. And one other thing I'll add to the debate is that sanctions provide for administrative freezing. It's not judicial freezing. And in addition to sanctions objectives, etc., that was mentioned, it's an administrative freezing and seizing. So that's why we cannot jump the rope directly and confiscate that money. I have one question. I would like to put one question to all the panelists, which we are grappling also. I'm from Open Society, by the way, I didn't say it because of the mic issues. None of these people that are sanctioned they are not sanctioned for corruption. So this debate to me is a little bit out of the scope. They are sanctioned because of their role supporting war in Ukraine. So to debate, to return this money to the victims of the corruption is a little bit, to me, I would like to ask panelists how they view that. And in addition to that question, we'll see a lot of litigation from particularly oligarchs or politically exposed persons, because the way sanctions has been done, it has been done in a lot of rush. There was a lot of political momentum, and many of them probably are not on a legally sound basis, particularly those who are oligarchs, and their links need to be very solidly proven. So how do we marry this to the discussions we have about confiscation and repatriation of these funds? Just want to highlight today, the Guardian reported that there is an initiative, a consortium of Ukrainian and international lawyers that are preparing to launch a civil legal action against Russian state and use it for confiscation and reparation of the assets. But we are talking here, the estimation in the article talks about $1 trillion for damages, which is the people who lost their loved ones, properties, etc. And how do we balance this? Even 2.5 billion pounds might be drop in the sea if you talk about $1 trillion already now, and probably this money will increase. So how do you balance these issues, also the amount of money that is needed for the reparation and for reconstruction?
Thanks so much, Tika. I mean, I think we've had a lot of really, really good questions, and I'm not gonna I'm not sure we can answer all of these questions within the format we have here, so I don't want to put too much pressure on our panelists to answer all of these questions. But I think so far I've clustered them into four, I think. So maybe I can start with the first one, which was about the question, I guess, of new techniques and the morality of some of the techniques which are being used. I don't know if, Liana, you would like to maybe go into a bit more detail about some of the ideas that you have said, which are also ideas which are actually not just ideas, but also there are things which are potentially happening. If you could talk a bit more about this.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I sort of had those sort of like two key ideas. The one about repurposing fines from sanctions breaches, I think is fairly solid. I don't think it's too controversial. I think it's sort of a good way to go, but relies on proper resourcing of sanctions monitoring and enforcement. The sort of moralities around buying their way out of sanctions, I mean, it is morally very hazardous. And I think the sort of points that were raised in the questions really brings it back to, what do the people of Ukraine want? What do also, as it was raised, the victims of Russia in Russia want? And would they be satisfied with that? The balance of foregoing a level of justice, for practical reparations delivery. And, I think sort of some of the points we've heard today leans towards, ultimately we would rather see these people held to account and not being given a way out of accountability. But I think that sort of boils down to why victim guidance on these things is absolutely critical.
Thanks so much. I mean, Sarah, I wonder if have any of these kind of new techniques or like different methods been proposed also in the French context that you know about? Is this something which is taking place more in the UK, or is it also something taking place outside?
It is taking place more in the UK and in the common law countries rather than in France and civil law countries, because first in France, confiscation is can only occur within a criminal context, which requires a higher level of proof, etc. And so, I mean, we are really far from these new techniques. But I must say that a couple of weeks ago, an oligarch has tried to escape from the sanction, and he had a yacht, and so the French authorities could seize and not freeze the yacht because of this try of escaping the sanction. But I want to say that I think, of course, we cannot improve our tools, etc. But we have some tools in France that are really interesting and that could be used to really find evidence of corruption behind the wealth of the Russian oligarchs, and to lead to seizure and confiscation. For instance, we have the presumption of money laundering, which can be used by prosecutors when they face a complex scheme of proxies, shell companies, offshore companies, etc. When the scheme they face is too complex to seem legal, then there is a reverse of the burden of proof, and the defender must prove that all the scheme, all the structure he made to hide his identity, to hide the origin of his wealth, as a illicit goal. And this is really, really powerful. We don't use it as much as we should do. It's the same for the UK and explained wealth order, but it's really powerful. And if we could use it in these cases, it could really, ease the investigation. We would not have, and when I say we, I mean the French authorities, the French prosecutor would not have to prove, to discover the origin of the asset. They just reverse the burden of proof when there's such a complexity that it's illegal. And I think we, of course, new techniques can be, there's good and less good reasons to go in this way, but I think we should also use what we already have, and as everyone said in the panel, just provide resources, really enforce what we already have.
Thanks so much. I think the next group of questions, maybe I'm also butchering the understanding of the questions that people pose, but I grouped kind of towards the question of implementation. So both in the sense of are the asset recovery offices the way to strengthen how we implement sanctions? Would focusing on whistleblowers be a way to do this? And also a question from the chat that Sue asked about is Italy doing this better than others, and what is the Italian example? Maria, I don't know if you're able, since you talked about implementation, I don't know whether you would be interested in weighing in on this area.
Yeah, I think that first of all, to reply to the question about the directive, I was quite happy. I cannot talk about for every European member states, because I'm not aware if every country has actually, recovery offices as, for instance, developed as the Italian one, or even just the French. Well, France is generally quite avant-garde in terms of asset recovery, but I do welcome them in terms, at least for information sharing. Whenever there is a matter of tracing assets, I think that the more cooperation, the better. Again, the directive doesn't really explain how these offices are going to work. So that's a question that I suppose is going to see the moment these are implemented. I quite welcomed in the directive a whole setting up of the so-called, asset management offices that are aimed at keeping the value of the property, because this is another issue that we haven't really discussed in the presentation, but how value of property that is being seized, it changes. And so what do you do when you want to return it? So I think that's another question that we will need to think about. Who's going to pay for the upkeep, for instance, of all these assets that have been sanctioned and have been frozen in the future in terms of asset recovery? How can we manage to keep the value of this property the same? So I actually welcome that. the other questions I don't really remember where I remember hearing something about crypto. Again, I cannot really comment on the crypto, but I do know that in the Queen's speech, part of the Economic Crime Act 2 or 2.0 that was announced, it will deal also with crypto asset seizure. Once again, it was just mentioned. We don't really know what it's going to do, but we're waiting. So hopefully it's going to come out. Well, it will come out 100%, or at least we hope, in the next parliamentary session in the UK. And finally, the Italian model. I'm not speaking just because I'm Italian, but I think that the Italians are doing quite well in terms of asset recovery. We do indeed have a lot of experience with the mafia. And what happens with asset recovery there is, again, it's very difficult sometimes to show and to prove the link to criminality and the mafia association of some individuals. So what the Italians have is the so-called preventative seizure and confiscation measures. To explain it very quickly, it's basically 2 steps. First, there is a temporary freeze of the property for which the competent authority needs to prove that the individual that is subject to this measure represents a sort of social danger, and that they directly or indirectly control property that is suspicious. So this is the first step. The second step is a confiscation order, which is issued, like basically it's the moment where the burden shifts to the defendant, and it is up to the defendant to show that the assets in question are lawfully obtained. So it's a mixed mechanism that so far has been quite successful, and that it comprises a series of interesting crimes, including there is a part specifically that talks about that extends essentially the list to those who appear on the UN Security Committee freezing list. What happens? It basically includes individuals that are subject to sanctions. However, there is a caveat. In the case of the Italian legislation, it's just for those who are either whose funds are either believed to be connected or have been used in relation to terrorist financing activities. So that's the caveat there. And it's very complicated to explain in like 5 minutes, but what happens is that the definition of terrorism and terrorist association and a terrorist organization in Italy, it's quite vast due to what happened in the 70s and what happened in the 90s, and the fact that the mafia used to engage, or sometimes still does, in terrorist activities per se. So it's a very interesting mechanism that I think, again, when I talked about this Frankenstein monster, it's definitely one point that I keep on pushing for people to keep into consideration. It's not a solution, a one-size-fits-all. You have to apply to the matter of the oligarchs, and obviously it's going to be quite lengthy, but it is definitely a start. And I think that while reading the EU directive, I quite felt a little bit of an Italian flavor. So there were some crimes. It was very, very targeting on organized criminal activities mainly, rather than the oligarchs. So this is why I think that the Italians quite influenced there. So everything is welcome.
Thanks so much. Yeah, super interesting points. The last kind of area that, well, it's an area, but it's also the question that Tika raised about, are we just talking about corruption and sanctions, and actually these are 2 completely separate things, because as we know, the basis for the Russian sanctions were not these mechanisms which we've spent a long time working on, which are these anti-corruption sanctions, which many of us have been engaged on many years, and actually in the end it was just regular political sanctions that were used in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So firstly, are we just talking about maybe the wrong thing? Is it even worth talking about corruption? I mean, I guess this is the broader sense of your question, Tika. But also, I guess then really comes here as again, as we've seen, even with the implementation of misappropriation sanctions in the EU level, which were the sanctions relating to Russia, relating to Egypt, Ukraine, and Tunisia, are we at risk of legal challenges coming soon or eventually with respect to these sanctions? Anybody want to jump in? Maybe Sarah?
Yeah, really quickly. I think, yes, that's a real threat. They can hire the best lawyers, and I mean, even if you do your best with the best lawyers, it's really complicated to sometimes just target the goal. So yes, this is a real threat, and I really think that I mean, maybe just as a conclusion from my side, this is, we are in the middle of the Russian crisis with the Ukrainian war, but they will have other crises, and we should be ready for the next ones. Just to perhaps just not just, but provide more resources and open our BO registries. Just enforce all the recommendations civil society organizations and experts and working groups have recommended for years, just to be ready for the next ones. So as for the sanctions and the risk for them to be encompassed or to fall because some loopholes. Yes, I think it's really real, and it's also real for anti-corruption investigations. Just in France, a couple of years ago, the French prosecutor targeted a Russian oligarch for fiscal fraud, and they could just target the intermediaries at the end of the day, because the Russian oligarch just, could avoid all the prosecution. He had the best lawyer, and now, it's not. At least we have the intermediaries, but they're just the notary, not even the bank, and some lawyers that will face justice in France. So we should also make sure that those loopholes disappear.
Thanks so much. I think that's also a good summary of everything you've talked about. So that's super useful. I don't know, we have only a couple of minutes left, so I don't know if Maria or Liana, you want to say a few last words. Maybe I can offer Maria first.
Yes, aside from agreeing once again with what Sarah just said, I think that again, we wouldn't at any point in the presentation we assumed that there was the role of sanctions and the role of asset confiscation was blurred. So what happens is, if we want to really move towards asset confiscations, we will need separate, lengthier, potentially mechanisms. So these are very different things. I think that more importantly, any measure that we take today should stand the test of time. So we know that the London laundromat, the Russia dirty money was an issue, was a national security issue before the war in Ukraine. It will be an issue long after the war in Ukraine. And so will corrupt money, dirty money that flows into London and other parts of the world. So what happens is that now we really need to think about why we want to devise these asset recovery mechanisms. Is it because we want to move from fris to cease because we are trying to persuade Putin to stop waging war, or disincentivize as well other countries from following suit? Or is it because at the origin of these wells, there is a corruption, there is a crime that actually took place? I think that asset recovery, as I said at the beginning, there is an inherent criminal justice policy goal that needs to be respected and needs to be always kept in mind when drafting new legislation. Ukraine or no Ukraine, Russia or Russia, I think that that's the main problem. Dirty money has been a problem way before and will be a problem long after this crisis.
Thanks a lot. Really, really, really important points to think about. Liana, do you want to say a couple of last words?
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of pick up on Tika's points. Yeah, there definitely is an issue with how quickly these Russian sanctions have been brought in, how rapidly the legislation's been created, and we're definitely expecting to see some challenges to them. And I think that reinforces the concerns we have about legislation or potential legislation which confiscates on the basis of a sanctions designation, because confiscation is basically removing someone's rights in a way on the basis of a very low evidentiary and legal threshold. And that's actually the proposals that are coming out in Canada, and it looks like really promising that one of them might be passed, appear to be of that nature, confiscating based on a sanctions designation, which feels extremely flimsy. So I think it sort of kind of just all comes back to the main theme of tonight's discussion, which is, if we're going to be confiscating, we need to be doing it properly.
Thanks again. That's a really excellent note to finish on. And let me just take the chance now to thank you all. Maria, Sarah, Liana, for really interesting presentations and really interesting discussions. Thanks to everybody for being here and joining us in what is the evening for most of us. So we're really happy that you participated and your interest in this topic. Thank you for everyone that asked questions. We've had a really, from my side, I think we've had a really great discussion here. Lots of things to think about, but hopefully also it's great to hear they're all thinking about these things as well. As we move forward, I think there's a lot of work for civil society and policymakers to do around these topics, and it's great that we could connect here and start having or continue having this discussion that we've also already been having for months and also years in the past. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.